My name is Sarah, and I'll never forget the summer I spent at my Aunt Margaret's house. The memories of those days still haunt me, creeping into my thoughts when I least expect it. It was the summer before I turned 16. My parents were going through a rough patch and decided to take a trip to rekindle their marriage, or so they said. They left me with Aunt Margaret, my mother's older sister, in her big, creaky house at the edge of a sleepy little town. Aunt Margaret was a peculiar woman, always keeping to herself, and I barely knew her. My mother had spoken about her in hushed tones, with a mixture of pity and unease, but I never understood why. From the moment I arrived, the house felt wrong. It was as if the walls were watching me, silently observing my every move. The air inside was thick and heavy, with a faint smell of decay lingering in the corners. Aunt Margaret greeted me with a tight-lipped smile and cold eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. The first few nights were uneventful, though the oppressive silence of the house made it difficult to sleep. I often heard strange noises, soft whispers, faint footsteps in the hallway, but whenever I gathered the courage to investigate, I found nothing. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I passed Aunt Margaret's closed bedroom door, I heard it again, those whispers, louder this time. I pressed my ear to the door, and my heart froze. It wasn't just one voice. There were many, speaking in a language I didn't understand. I knocked lightly, trying to dismiss the growing dread in my chest. The voices stopped abruptly. I called out to Aunt Margaret, but there was no answer. I slowly opened the door, my hand trembling. The room was dark, illuminated only by the pale moonlight filtering through the window. Aunt Margaret was lying in bed, perfectly still, her back facing me. I whispered her name, but she didn't move. A sense of unease gnawed at me as I stepped closer. The air around her bed was freezing, and I could see my breath fog in the air. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but as soon as my fingers brushed her skin, she bolted upright, her eyes wide open and staring straight ahead. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. Aunt Margaret didn't look at me. She seemed to be in a trance, her eyes glassy and unblinking. Her lips moved as she muttered something under her breath, too low for me to hear. I wanted to run, but I was rooted to the spot by a fear so intense it felt like a vice around my heart. Suddenly, Aunt Margaret turned her head towards me, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her eyes locked onto mine, and a twisted smile spread across her face. "You shouldn't be here, Sarah," she whispered in a voice that wasn't her own. It was deep and raspy, as if something else was speaking through her. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me, and raced back to my own bedroom. I locked the door and sat on the bed, my entire body shaking. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, too terrified to close my eyes. The next morning, Aunt Margaret was back to her old self, acting as if nothing had happened. I tried to bring it up, but she just smiled and told me I must have been dreaming. But I knew better. Something was wrong with her, something deeply, horribly wrong. As the days passed, the strange occurrences intensified. I would catch glimpses of shadows moving in the corners of my vision, hear voices calling my name from empty rooms. Aunt Margaret grew more distant, often disappearing into the basement for hours. She forbade me from going down there, claiming it was her private space. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was happening in that basement. When I was sure Aunt Margaret was asleep, I crept down the stairs, careful to avoid the creaky spots in the floorboards. The basement door was slightly ajar, a dim light spilling out from the cracks. I pushed the door open and descended the stairs, the cold air biting at my skin. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and dusty boxes, but in the center of the room, there was something else. An altar of sorts, covered in strange symbols and surrounded by candles, their flames flickering in the darkness. And there, in front of the altar, was Aunt Margaret, kneeling with her back to me, chanting in that same guttural voice I'd heard that first night. Her hands were stained with something dark, and as she turned to face me, I saw the madness in her eyes. "You shouldn't have come here, Sarah," she hissed, her voice twisting with malice. Now it's too late. Before I could react, the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, swirling around her like a dark, malevolent force. I felt them closing in on me, cold and suffocating, pulling me towards the altar. Aunt Margaret began to laugh, a sound so chilling it echoed in my bones. I don't remember how I got out of that basement. The next thing I knew, I was running down the street, the house disappearing behind me in the mist. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest neighbor's house, pounding on the door, screaming for help. When the police arrived, they found the basement empty, the altar gone. Aunt Margaret was sitting calmly in her living room, denying everything, her eyes devoid of any emotion. They didn't believe me, of course, chalking it up to a frightened teenager's overactive imagination. But I know what I saw. I know what she is. And even now, years later, I can still hear her laughter in my nightmares, still feel the cold grip of those shadows whenever I close my eyes. I haven't been back to that house since. I never will.
My name is Michael, and I'll never forget the night I decided to take the long way home. It was a late autumn evening, and I had stayed at work much later than usual. The office was nearly empty when I finally left, and the cold air outside bit at my face as I walked to my car. The streets were quiet, the only sounds being the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. I usually took the main road home, but that night I felt an inexplicable urge to take a different route, a winding, narrow road that cut through a thick, dark forest. I'd driven it once before during the day, and I remembered it being a peaceful, scenic drive. But at night it was a different story. As soon as I turned onto the road, I felt a sense of unease. The trees loomed tall on either side, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. My headlights barely penetrated the darkness ahead, and the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, as if leading me deeper into the unknown. A few miles in, I noticed something strange. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their branches almost touching, creating a tunnel of darkness. The road itself began to narrow, and I had to slow down to avoid veering off into the ditch. That's when I saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road just ahead. It was a woman, her pale skin almost glowing in the darkness. She wore a long, tattered dress, and her hair hung in damp, tangled strands around her face. She didn't move as I approached, just stood there, staring at me with hollow, lifeless eyes. I slowed to a crawl, unsure of what to do. She looked like she needed help, but there was something about her that set off alarm bells in my head. My heart pounded as I rolled down the window, just enough to ask if she was okay. "Do you need a ride?" I called out, my voice shaky. She didn't respond, didn't even blink. Instead, she slowly raised her arm and pointed down the road, into the pitch-black darkness ahead. A chill ran down my spine. Everything in me screamed to drive away, to turn around and take the main road home. But something compelled me to keep going, to follow the direction she was pointing. I drove past her, keeping my eyes on the road ahead, but I couldn't resist glancing in the rearview mirror. She was gone. The road behind me was empty, as if she had never been there. The further I drove, the more surreal everything became. The trees pressed in closer, their branches scraping against the sides of the car like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to rise from the ground, obscuring the road. Then I saw it, a house, barely visible through the fog, sitting just off the road. It was old and decrepit, its windows dark and empty. The sight of it filled me with a sense of dread so intense that I almost stopped the car. But before I could, the engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in front of the house. I tried to restart the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. Panic set in, and I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. Suddenly, I heard a noise. A soft, shuffling sound coming from the direction of the house. I looked up, and through the fog, I saw the front door slowly creak open. My breath caught in my throat as a shadowy figure emerged from the doorway, moving towards me with an unnatural, jerky gait. I fumbled with the car keys, desperate to get the engine started, but it was no use. The figure was getting closer, and I could now make out its features. A twisted, distorted version of the woman I had seen earlier, her face a mask of rage and despair. She reached the car and pressed her face against the window, her eyes burning with an unnatural light. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to scream. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the car roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas, tearing down the road without looking back. The fog swallowed the house behind me, and the trees began to thin out as I finally reached the main road. When I got home, I was shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the door. I locked every window and door, but sleep never came that night. All I could think about was the woman's lifeless eyes and the terror that had gripped me on that dark, twisted road. I never took that route again. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls through the trees, I can still hear her whispering my name, calling me back to that long, lonely road where she waits for me.